The courthouse stood tall at the corner of Main Street, its red brick walls glowing faintly under the morning sun. Inside, however, the air was heavy with unease. Everyone present knew this was not an ordinary day, nor an ordinary trial. Whispers traveled like ripples across the wooden benches, bouncing between anxious family members, curious townsfolk, and the press scribbling notes in small, hurried letters. Reporters had been warned to keep their distance from the witnesses, but their pens never rested, eager to capture each flicker of human emotion. At the very center of this storm sat the most unexpected figure, a child barely 3 years old, with tiny legs swinging nervously from a chair too big for them. Their shoes, bright red and scuffed at the edges, tapped softly against the wooden frame. To the casual eye, they looked far too small, far too innocent to be part of something so immense. Yet here they were, seated at the heart of a courtroom packed with strangers, their presence carrying a weight no one could deny. The child's guardian sat closely beside them, a protective hand resting on their shoulder. Every so often, the guardian leaned down, whispering words of reassurance. The child would nod slightly but kept their eyes lowered, staring at the smooth grain of the courtroom floor as though searching for courage somewhere in its patterns. On one side of the room, the prosecution team shuffled through their files. The lead prosecutor, a woman with a calm but determined expression, paused occasionally to glance at the child. Her gaze wasn't stern or demanding. It was filled with an unspoken promise: "We will keep you safe." She knew the importance of this moment and how delicate it was. A 3-year-old could not be expected to testify like an adult. Still, their presence alone, their willingness to be here, meant everything. Across the aisle, the defense sat with practiced composure. Their lead attorney leaned back slightly, his arms crossed in a gesture of confidence, though his eyes betrayed a quiet calculation. He was watching the child carefully, as though every flicker of hesitation or fear could be twisted into an advantage. To him, the trial was a chess match, and this small witness was nothing more than a risky piece on the board. The judge, seated high upon the bench, adjusted his glasses and scanned the room. He was a man of many years, seasoned by countless trials that had crossed his courtroom, yet this day felt different to him. He had seen hardened criminals break down under cross-examination, seasoned officers crack under pressure, but never had he presided over a case where a toddler was at its center. His gavel, polished smooth from years of use, sat untouched. For now, silence held the room. The jury members shifted in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. They, too, felt the unusual weight of the day. Some had children of their own and could not help but imagine their little ones sitting in that chair, surrounded by strangers, expected to play a role in matters far beyond their understanding. Empathy stirred within them, softening the rigid walls that usually separated facts from feelings. Every cough, every shuffle of papers seemed in that silence. The child fidgeted, pulling at the hem of their shirt, their tiny fingers trembling slightly. Their guardian squeezed their shoulder gently, grounding them. The courtroom's atmosphere was thick with tension. This was not a moment of high drama, yet it was more gripping than any outburst could be. It was the quiet before something profound, the pause before history in the making. Everyone knew the child's voice, should it be heard, could shift the entire trial. The question was, would it emerge at all? In the back of the room, 2 officers stood by the door, their presence a reminder of the seriousness of the case. Their faces, usually hardened by duty, softened as their eyes landed on the child. They had seen countless trials, countless testimonies, but something about this one reached them differently. Perhaps it was the innocence seated in the middle of a storm meant for adults. Perhaps it was the unfairness of a world that required such a small soul to shoulder such weight. The ticking of the courtroom clock became the soundtrack of the moment. Each second stretched longer than the last. The prosecutor cleared her throat gently, shuffling her notes, but she didn't rush. She knew better. Timing was everything here. To push too soon could shatter the fragile courage building inside that little chest. The judge leaned forward, his voice breaking the silence. "We will proceed when ready," he said, not unkindly. It was a rare softness in his tone, one that didn't go unnoticed. He was not merely addressing the lawyers. He was addressing the child, giving them space, letting them know this was their pace to set. All eyes returned to the small figure in the chair. Some eyes held sympathy, others curiosity, and a few skepticism. But regardless of the lens through which they looked, none could deny that the child's presence had already changed the air of the room. The child raised their eyes for a fleeting moment, scanning the sea of unfamiliar faces. The room seemed impossibly large, every shadow stretching wider, every sound echoing louder. They quickly looked down again, clutching at their guardian's hand. Fear was etched into their small movements, but so too was a quiet resilience, an unspoken strength that no one had expected. Somewhere outside, church bells rang faintly in the distance, their sound filtering through the thick courthouse walls. For a brief moment, the sound anchored the child, reminding them of something familiar beyond this suffocating space. The journalists scribbled faster, sensing the electricity in the air. They knew something important was building, though none could predict how it would unfold. The defense attorney's smirk faltered, as though he too felt the shift. And so the stage was set. A courtroom, divided between hope and doubt, stood suspended in anticipation. The smallest voice in the room had not yet spoken, but its silence was already louder than words. Everyone leaned forward, waiting. They did not yet know that soon, with the help of an unlikely companion, that very silence would break, not with lengthy explanations or rehearsed testimony, but with two simple words that would ripple through every heart present. For now, though, the story rested here, in a courtroom full of adults, on the shoulders of a child whose very presence was rewriting what justice could mean. The tension inside the courtroom was so thick it felt as though even the air had weight. People sat forward in their seats, breaths shallow, eyes trained on the small child at the center of the trial. No one dared to move too much or speak above a whisper, as if the smallest disturbance might frighten the child into silence forever. Then from the back of the room came a sound unlike anything expected in such a solemn setting. It was soft, rhythmic, paws clicking gently against the polished wooden floor. Heads turned instinctively, curiosity replacing tension for the first time that morning. The double doors at the rear of the room parted, and through them stepped a uniformed handler, his posture firm but expression kind. By his side walked the one presence that could melt walls thicker than steel, a large police dog, trained not just to serve in the line of duty, but also to comfort and protect. The animal's coat gleamed under the courtroom's fluorescent lights, golden brown with darker streaks that seemed painted by patience and loyalty. Its head was held high, ears alert, yet its stride carried no aggression, only calm assurance. There was no bark, no tug at the leash, only steady, deliberate steps as it entered the room like a guardian made of flesh and fur. A subtle ripple traveled through the crowd. The prosecutors glanced up with relief. The defense shifted uneasily, murmuring among themselves. Jurors straightened in their chairs, some smiling unconsciously as their eyes followed the dog's entrance. Even the judge, who had seen many strange courtroom spectacles over the years, allowed the faintest quirk of a smile to soften his otherwise stern expression. But it was the child who changed most of all. At first, they were startled by the sound of paws, lifting their small head cautiously to see what was coming. Fear still lingered in their wide eyes, but when those eyes landed on the dog, something shifted. Their lips parted ever so slightly in recognition, perhaps not recognition of this particular animal, but of something safe, something trustworthy in a room that had until now felt impossibly cold and foreign. The handler led the dog closer, pausing a respectful distance from the witness stand. "Permission to allow inside," he asked formally, addressing the judge. His voice carried no doubt, only a gentle confidence. The judge nodded, lifting a hand as if to bless the entrance. "Proceed," he said, his voice steady but touched with warmth. The dog was guided gently to the child's side. He sat gracefully on his haunches, not fidgeting, not restless, simply present. His handler knelt to whisper something into his ear, though no one else could hear. Whatever the words were, his deep brown eyes never wavered from the child. The child blinked, still gripping their guardian's sleeve. Slowly, cautiously, their tiny hand uncurled from the fabric, reaching down toward the dog. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The child's fingers brushed over his head, sinking into the soft fur between his ears. It was a small gesture, almost hesitant, but the effect was enormous. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted as though a heavy fog had lifted. Where fear had once weighed on the room, warmth now seeped in quietly, carried on the steady presence of the dog. Did not move suddenly or demand attention. He simply leaned into the child's hand, eyes half closing in contentment, a living anchor against the storm. The guardian's eyes watered as they watched the small hand continue to stroke the dog's fur. The prosecutor glanced at the jury, noticing how their shoulders relaxed, how even the most skeptical among them softened their gazes. The defense team scribbled hurried notes, but their unease was evident. They had not expected this. They had not planned for the undeniable bond forming in real time before 12 impartial witnesses. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, capturing the scene. One whispered to another, "You can't script this. This is something people will talk about for years." The child's breathing slowed, no longer shallow and panicked. Their shoulders eased, and though their eyes still darted nervously around the courtroom, they always returned to the dog, as though understanding the role he was meant to play, let out a deep, calming breath and lay down at the child's feet. His head rested gently against their small shoes, and the child giggled faintly, the first sound resembling joy since entering the room. The giggle spread like sunlight through the crowd. Jurors smiled without realizing it. Even the bailiff, who had been stone-faced since morning, allowed the corners of his mouth to lift. The judge cleared his throat, pretending to shuffle papers, but his eyes betrayed his approval. The prosecutor seized the moment with care. She stepped forward but kept her voice soft, more like a caring teacher than a courtroom attorney. "Do you feel okay with here?" she asked, her eyes kind and unwavering. The child nodded. It was a simple nod, but it was enough to send another ripple of relief through the room. "That's good," the prosecutor continued gently. "You don't have to be scared. It's here to help you, and we're all here to listen when you're ready." The defense attorney leaned forward, opening his mouth as though to object, but the judge's raised eyebrow silenced him. This was not a moment to interrupt, not when a frightened child was finally beginning to find calm. The child bent down slightly, their forehead almost brushing his head. In a whisper too soft for most to hear, they said something to the dog. The handler caught it, smiling to himself. The child had not spoken to anyone else, not yet, but they had spoken to. And that, in itself, was progress no one could dismiss. The silence in the room was no longer heavy. It was reverent. The kind of silence reserved for sacred moments when something extraordinary was unfolding. People realized they were witnessing not just a trial, but a lesson in humanity. A lesson that sometimes truth did not come from stern words or legal strategies. Sometimes truth found its way through fur, paws, and the unwavering loyalty of a creature who asked for nothing in return. The judge finally broke the silence. "We'll take a brief recess," he announced, though his tone lacked the usual sternness. "The witness may remain with during the break." As the gavel tapped lightly, people rose slowly, unwilling to disturb the fragile peace that had settled. The child remained seated, stroking the dog's head with steady rhythm, their earlier trembling now nearly gone. Outside the courtroom doors, whispers grew louder. Reporters rushed to call in their editors. Family members embraced one another, tears in their eyes. No one doubted it now. The dog had done what no human could have. He had opened the door to courage. Inside, the child whispered again into his ear, words only the dog could hear. Whatever was said, the little one smiled faintly afterward and wagged his tail once, a silent vow that he would stay as long as needed. And so, the second act of this story closed not with dramatic speeches or arguments, but with the quiet, steady heartbeat of a bond forming in plain sight. The courtroom had changed. The people had changed. The child had changed. All because of a dog who walked in on clicking paws and reminded everyone that sometimes the greatest heroes don't wear uniforms, argue cases, or sit behind benches. Sometimes they simply sit quietly by your side, giving you the strength to face the unthinkable. The recess had ended, and the courtroom slowly filled again, like a theater waiting for its next act. The jurors returned to their seats, their faces serious but softer than before. The journalists flipped open fresh notebooks, pens ready, sensing that what was unfolding would be retold far beyond these courthouse walls. Family members whispered prayers under their breath, clinging to hope. But at the center of all this noise and expectation sat the smallest figure, legs still dangling above the floor. The 3-year-old child leaned close to the police dog who had entered like a guardian angel only moments before. The child's fingers tangled in the dog's fur, as though gripping it for strength. The judge's gavel tapped once and the courtroom hushed. All eyes shifted to the child, and instantly the warmth of the recess evaporated. The room seemed to grow larger, its walls stretching further, shadows deepening, every gaze heavy with unspoken pressure. The prosecutor stepped forward, her smile gentle, her tone as soft as a lullaby. "You're safe here," she said, crouching slightly so her eyes were level with the child. "Is with you. Your guardian is here. You don't have to be afraid." But fear is stubborn. Fear doesn't simply vanish because someone says so. The child's lips pressed together tightly, trembling with effort. Their hands gripped the dog's fur until the knuckles turned pale. Sensing the struggle, shifted closer, resting his chin across the child's shoes. Still, the weight of the courtroom pressed down, threatening to suffocate whatever words might have been forming. The prosecutor tried again. "Can you tell me your name?" she asked gently, starting with the simplest question. The child's throat bobbed with a swallow. Their mouth opened halfway, then closed. The silence was painful, stretching across the room until even the ticking clock on the wall seemed too loud. Across the aisle, the defense attorney leaned back in his chair, lips curling into a faint smirk. He tapped his pen against his legal pad, confident that the silence meant victory. A child's testimony, he had argued from the beginning, was unreliable. And now, with each passing second, the courtroom seemed to be proving him right. Jurors shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at one another. Their empathy remained, but doubt began to creep in. Could this tiny witness truly carry the weight of such a case? Could a voice so small pierce through the fortress of evidence, arguments, and strategies that surrounded them? The child's guardian leaned down, whispering something only they could hear. The child nodded faintly but still could not speak. The prosecutor refused to give up. She changed her approach, her tone softer still. "Do you like?" she asked, pointing to the dog at the child's feet. For a moment something flickered in the child's eyes. Their lips parted slightly, but the sound never came. Instead, they buried their face against their guardian's side, shoulders trembling with fear. A heavy sigh rippled through the courtroom, not of frustration but of helplessness. The judge's brow furrowed as he watched the child's struggle. He had presided over countless trials, but rarely had he seen a moment so fragile, so human, so impossible to measure by the rules of procedure. The defense attorney leaned forward this time, sensing his advantage. He whispered to his co-counsel, who nodded, jotting down a note. Their strategy had been clear from the start. Let the child's silence undo the prosecution's case. And right now, silence seemed louder than any testimony. But silence can be deceiving. At the child's feet, shifted again, releasing a low, steady breath. The sound was soft, almost like a sigh, but the child felt it. Their tiny hand reached out instinctively, resting against the dog's head. For a brief moment, the child's breathing matched his, the same rhythm, the same steadiness. It was as though the dog had lent them his courage. The prosecutor noticed. She didn't press further, not yet. Instead, she let the moment linger, giving the child space to draw strength. It wasn't a legal tactic, it was compassion, the kind that went beyond the walls of the courtroom. Still, the silence dragged on and the tension became unbearable. A juror coughed, startling the child, who flinched and pressed closer too. The defense attorney raised an eyebrow, as though to say, "This is going nowhere." The judge finally intervened, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. "Take your time, little one," he said gently. "You don't need to rush." His words, though simple, carried a weight of authority softened by kindness. The child looked up at the bench, eyes wide, as though surprised that even the stern man in the black robe was on their side. But fear still held them in place, like invisible chains. In the gallery, a motherly figure from the community, who had come simply to support, clasped her hands together, whispering under her breath. The room was not divided between prosecution and defense in that moment. It was united in the desperate hope that this child would find a voice. But the child did not speak. Not yet. Their eyes darted toward the defense attorney, whose sharp suit and cool smirk seemed more frightening than anything else in the room. They quickly looked away, burying their face in fur. The silence returned, heavier than before. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably again. The prosecutor exhaled slowly, trying not to show her disappointment. The defense attorney leaned back, smugness spreading like ink across his features. To him, silence was proof. Silence was victory. But those who watched closely knew the truth. This wasn't the silence of refusal. It wasn't the silence of deceit. It was the silence of a battle being fought inside a tiny heart, a battle between fear and courage. And though fear seemed to be winning, something stronger was stirring, slowly, quietly, but undeniably. The handler of the police dog caught the child's eye and gave a reassuring nod. He had seen this before. Children too scared to speak, but slowly learning that courage could be borrowed from the steady presence of a loyal companion. He knew the silence was not the end. It was only the beginning of something that could break wide open. The prosecutor closed her file, signaling she would pause for now. "No more questions at this moment, Your Honor," she said softly. The judge nodded, his eyes lingering on the child. The defense attorney smirked, certain that the child would never speak. But the others in the room, jurors, family members, even the judge himself, sensed something different. The silence was heavy, yes, but it was charged with possibility, like the stillness before a storm. The child pressed closer too, whispering something only the dog could hear. The handler caught the faint movement of lips but didn't reveal what was said. For now, it was enough to know the child's voice wasn't gone. It was simply waiting. And so the courtroom remained, caught between silence and revelation, fear and courage, doubt and hope. No one knew it yet, but the breakthrough was coming. And when it did, it would arrive not in long, complicated sentences, but in the simplest way possible, two words that would echo louder than any testimony ever could. The silence in the courtroom was unbearable. It wasn't the ordinary silence of order being kept. It was the fragile, painful silence of a child too small to carry the burden being asked of them. Every cough, every creak of wood echoed far louder than it should have, underscoring the absence of words from the one person everyone waited for. The prosecutor, standing patiently by the witness stand, glanced at the child with gentle eyes. She could see the effort written on their tiny face, the way their lips trembled, the way their chest rose and fell unevenly, the way their eyes darted between strangers, all full of fear. To demand more would be cruel. To stop entirely felt impossible. The defense attorney leaned back in his chair, arms folded across his chest, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. To him, the silence was confirmation. He had built his strategy on the idea that the child could never speak in such a setting. And now, every passing second seemed to prove him right. He scribbled something on his legal pad, a note to himself perhaps, or just a reminder to highlight the silence during his closing argument. The judge had been watching all of this closely. His years of experience told him that the law could be rigid, but justice demanded flexibility. He had seen witnesses break down before, but this was different. This was not a refusal to speak. It was fear, raw, suffocating fear. And fear, the judge knew, could either destroy truth or be transformed into courage, given the right environment. He cleared his throat softly, and the entire room stilled. The authority of his position carried weight, but there was something different in his tone this time. It wasn't sternness or formality, it was compassion. "We will take a pause," he said gently, looking directly at the child. His voice softened, each word chosen carefully. "There is no need to rush. This is your moment, little one, not ours. We will go at your pace." The words fell into the courtroom like a balm. The prosecutor straightened slightly, relieved. The jurors relaxed in their seats. Even the child seemed startled by the unexpected kindness in the judge's voice. Judges were supposed to be stern, distant figures in black robes, not soft-spoken protectors offering reassurance. Yet here he was, setting aside the rigid posture of authority and replacing it with the warmth of a grandfatherly presence. The handler, sensing the opportunity, gently guided closer to the child. The big dog moved with unhurried grace, lowering himself onto the floor beside the child's chair. With a sigh, he laid his head across their small knees, his weight warm and grounding. The child looked down, wide-eyed at the sudden closeness. Tentatively, they reached out a trembling hand and brushed their fingers through the soft fur on his head. The courtroom collectively held its breath. It was the smallest gesture, but its meaning was enormous. The child's guardian leaned closer, whispering encouragement. "It's okay. Here, you're safe." The child's breathing steadied a little. They stroked the dog again, longer this time, their tiny fingers tracing the ridge of his ear. Didn't flinch or move away. He simply stayed, his calm presence speaking louder than words could. The prosecutor crouched slightly, not too close, respecting the fragile space the child and dog were creating together. "He likes you," she said softly, smiling. "Do you like him?" The child looked at her for the briefest second, then quickly looked down again, cheeks flushing. No words yet, but the silence no longer felt empty. It was filling with something new, something fragile but growing, trust. The jurors exchanged quiet glances. They weren't just watching a trial anymore. They were witnessing something deeply human, something no transcript could ever capture. The judge leaned forward slightly, folding his hands on the bench. "You are very brave," he said, his voice carrying the weight of truth. "Braver than most people in this room. And bravery doesn't mean you aren't scared. It means you are scared, but you keep going anyway." The child blinked at him, absorbing the words. Their hand never left his fur, each stroke grounding them further in the moment. The defense attorney shifted in his seat, his smirk fatting. He could sense the tide turning. What had once been silence working in his favor was now being transformed into something else, something dangerous to his case. He leaned over to whisper to his co-counsel, but his eyes never left the child. He knew that if even a single word escaped those small lips, it could destroy everything he had built. The handler crouched beside, speaking softly to the child. "You don't have to talk to me or to anyone else if you don't want to, but if you want to tell something, you can. He's a very good listener." The child's eyes widened. They glanced at the handler, then at the dog. Slowly, they bent their head close to his ear, lips moving faintly. The words were inaudible to anyone else, but his ears twitched as if he had received them. The handler smiled but said nothing. He didn't need to. The simple fact that the child had spoken at all, even if only to the dog, was progress beyond what anyone had dared hope for. The prosecutor straightened, her heart pounding. She wanted to press forward to ask what had been said, but she resisted. The moment was delicate, like holding a butterfly in her hand, too much pressure and it would be crushed. Instead, she waited. The courtroom seemed to soften around the child. The wooden benches, the hard glares, the looming ceiling, all of it faded, if only slightly, against the warmth of his presence and the kindness of the judge's words. The child stroked the dog again, this time with more confidence. Their breathing slowed to a steady rhythm, rising and falling in sync with. It was as though the fear that had held them frozen was beginning to loosen its grip, replaced by something gentler, something stronger. The judge leaned back slightly, but his eyes never left the child. He knew this wasn't the end of the struggle, but it was a turning point. The child had crossed the first bridge, and bridges, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. The defense attorney's jaw tightened. He scribbled furiously in his notebook, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his worry. He had underestimated the bond between the child and the dog, and now that bond was threatening to undo his carefully built defense. The prosecutor allowed herself the faintest smile. She knew the moment had not yet reached its peak, but the foundation was there. The child's silence was no longer a wall, it was a doorway and was holding it open. And so the courtroom waited, suspended in the fragile space between silence and speech. Everyone knew what was coming, even if they couldn't say when. The child bent their head toward again, whispering something too soft for human ears. This time, however, they glanced up afterward, their eyes flickering with the faintest spark of courage. No words had been spoken aloud yet, but everyone in the room could feel it. The breakthrough was close, so close. The silence had changed. It was no longer fear's silence. It was the silence before a voice breaks through. And when that voice came, it would not be long, complicated testimony. It would be something much simpler, something pure, something unforgettable. The judge folded his hands once more, his eyes steady on the child. "Take all the time you need," he said. "This court will wait." And wait they did, every soul in the room leaning toward the smallest witness, knowing that history was about to be rewritten by the tiniest voice in the room. The quiet hum of the courtroom clock filled the air, each tick sounding like a drumbeat inside the hearts of those waiting. For nearly half an hour, everyone had witnessed the fragile dance between silence and courage. The child, sitting small in the oversized chair, had not spoken aloud to the adults, but something had shifted. The room could feel it. The dog had become more than just a comforting presence. He had become the child's bridge to safety. The judge watched carefully from the bench, his expression kind but unreadable. The jurors sat on the edge of their seats, their notes forgotten. The prosecutor clasped her hands, whispering a prayer under her breath that the moment would come. Even the defense attorney, usually so composed, seemed restless, drumming his fingers against the desk. And then it happened. The child leaned forward again, small lips brushing the dog's ear. Their voice was quiet, so quiet that not even the handler at side could hear it. But this time, instead of keeping it private, the handler spoke gently. "Sweetheart," he said in a hushed, encouraging tone, "you can tell what you just told him again, but louder. He wants everyone to hear your brave words." The child hesitated, fingers twisting into his fur. The silence stretched, heavy, suffocating. Everyone held their breath. The judge's eyes softened, silently giving permission. Shifted slightly, nudging his head closer into the child's lap, as if urging them forward. The child drew in a shaky breath, lifted their head, and whispered two words so fragile yet so powerful that they seemed to echo louder than any speech ever could. "He stayed." The words were soft, almost carried away by the air, but the microphone near the witness stand caught them. The phrase rippled through the room, bouncing off walls, searing into hearts. For a long moment, no one moved. The meaning of those two words settled slowly over the courtroom like a veil. The jurors glanced at one another, expressions shifting from confusion to sudden realization. The prosecutor's breath caught, her hand pressing against her chest. "He stayed." The child's testimony wasn't a long explanation or complicated account. It was a truth distilled into two simple words, words that carried all the weight of innocence, memory, and trust. The prosecutor stepped forward, careful not to overwhelm the moment. "Sweetheart," she said softly, kneeling slightly to meet the child's gaze, "can you tell us who stayed?" The child glanced nervously then at the judge, then finally at the prosecutor. Their lips trembled again, but the words came out in the faintest whisper, almost carried on the exhale of breath. He stayed in the room. The courtroom collectively inhaled. Those who had followed the case knew exactly what the child meant. The defendant had claimed he wasn't present during a crucial moment. But the child's innocent confirmation, spoken with such quiet certainty, told the opposite story. He hadn't left. He had stayed. The defense attorney bolted upright in his chair. "Objection," he barked, the words slicing through the fragile silence like a knife. "This is leading testimony. The child doesn't understand the implications." But his protest was cut short by the judge's raised hand. His voice was calm but firm. "Overruled. The child has spoken of their own accord. The court will respect their words." The defense attorney's jaw tightened. He slammed his pen down onto the desk, whispering furiously to his co-counsel. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The jurors could not hear those words. They could not see the bravery it had taken for such a small voice to break through such enormous fear. Meanwhile, the child pressed their face into fur, suddenly shy again after the explosion of courage. The handler stroked the dog back, murmuring, "Good job, buddy. You helped." The judge leaned slightly forward, his voice filled with warmth. "Young one," he said gently, "you have done something very important today. You spoke the truth, and that makes you very brave indeed." A murmur of emotion swept through the spectators seated in the back rows. Some wiped at their eyes, others shook their heads in amazement. The bailiff, usually stoic, glanced away, blinking quickly. The prosecutor knew better than to press further. To demand more would risk overwhelming the fragile courage that had just surfaced. Instead, she stood tall, her voice firm but gentle. "No further questions at this time, Your Honor." The judge nodded, turning his gaze to the defense table. "Cross-examination." The defense attorney rose slowly, his face pale but his movements deliberate. He approached the witness stand, his shoes echoing on the wood floor. The jurors watched closely, some with narrowed eyes, already skeptical of whatever tactic he might try. The attorney leaned slightly toward the child, his voice feigning gentleness. "Sweetheart, when you said he stayed, are you sure you weren't just talking about here? Maybe you meant the dog stayed with you, yes?" The child froze, eyes wide, clutching its ear for comfort. Their lips parted slightly, but no words came. The prosecutor immediately stood. "Objection," badgering the witness. "Overruled for now," the judge said cautiously, though his eyes warned the defense attorney to tread carefully. The attorney pressed on. "It's okay. Courtrooms can be scary and sometimes children get confused. Are you sure you didn't mean the dog stayed?" For a moment, it seemed the defense might succeed in twisting the child's words. The jurors leaned forward, tense. The child's shoulders shook, torn between fear and the truth they had just spoken. And then, without warning, the child lifted their face. Their voice was firmer this time, carrying more weight. "No, he stayed." The words rang through the courtroom like a bell. This time there was no mistaking them, no room to twist them. The child's tiny hand pointed, trembling but steady, toward the defendant. Gasps broke out among the spectators. The jurors' faces hardened. The prosecutor's eyes glistened with pride. Even the judge seemed momentarily shaken by the raw courage radiating from the smallest voice in the room. The defense attorney froze, his argument shattered. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, retreating to his table with shoulders slumped. He knew he had lost control of the narrative. The courtroom shifted in that moment. It was no longer just a trial, it was a reckoning. The power of truth, carried in two small words, had pierced through lies, manipulation, and fear. The judge gave a small nod, his voice reverent. "Let the record show," he said slowly, "that the witness has confirmed their statement clearly and without confusion." The child, exhausted but relieved, buried their face back into fur. The dog licked their cheek gently, as if congratulating them for their bravery. The handler whispered a soft, "Good girl, you did it." And just like that, the room knew everything had changed. The defense's confidence evaporated. The prosecutor's case had gained unshakable strength. The jurors, once uncertain, now carried the truth with them like a torch. 2 words, just 2. Yet they had shifted the entire weight of justice onto the right side of the scales. And in the silence that followed, every person in the room understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Not just the bravery of a child, but the undeniable reminder that truth, even whispered, has the power to roar. The words hung in the air like church bells ringing across a quiet valley. He stayed. No lawyer's statement, no forensic detail, no expert testimony could have carried the same weight as those 2 syllables from a trembling child. For a few seconds, time itself seemed to hold still inside the courthouse. The oak benches, the creaking ceiling fan, the polished floor, all of it faded into the background as the impact of the child's voice echoed in every heart. A juror in the front row of the box pressed her hand over her mouth, eyes shining with unshed tears. Another, a middle-aged man who had worn skepticism like armor throughout the trial, lowered his gaze, suddenly unable to meet the child's fragile courage head-on. The youngest juror, no older than 22, scribbled nothing on her notepad. She simply stared at the child, as though watching a miracle unfold. At the prosecution's table, the attorney sat motionless for a moment, then exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing for the first time in days. She had fought tirelessly to prepare evidence, to build a timeline, to bring credibility to witnesses. But she knew that none of it could ever compare to what had just happened. A child had spoken truth not as strategy, but as pure memory. That was irrefutable. The defense attorney's pen clattered onto his desk. He bent down, retrieving it with shaky fingers, but the sound betrayed him. His face flushed red, his lips pressed tight, and the once cocky tilt of his chin had disappeared. He scribbled furiously on his legal pad, but it was theater. Everyone in the room could sense his unraveling. The judge, a man who had presided over hundreds of cases in his long career, sat very still. His robe draped heavily around his shoulders, but his eyes, behind rimless glasses, were softened. He was not just hearing testimony. He was witnessing the kind of moment that would linger long after his career ended. Slowly, he leaned forward, steepling his fingers as if in prayer. His voice, when it came, was quiet yet steady. "Let the record show," he said, "that the witness has spoken clearly and the statement is entered into evidence." The clerk's fingers trembled slightly as she typed the words into the record. He stayed, official now, permanent. From the gallery in the back, soft murmurs spread like ripples across a pond. Parents who had come to watch wiped their eyes, some clutching their own children close. Reporters scribbled madly, sensing they had just witnessed the headline of the year. Even the usually stoic bailiff swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as he blinked against the sting of unexpected emotion. Shifted slightly, sensing the change in the air. His tail thumped once against the wooden floor, a subtle sound of reassurance. The child, still leaning into his fur, whispered something inaudible as though thanking him. He licked her hand, a quiet gesture that said more than any human could. The jurors watched this small exchange, their hearts tugged further. What struck them most was not just the testimony itself, but the purity of it. A child had no agenda, no script, no stake in the outcome other than truth. That truth had surfaced through a bond with a dog, a creature incapable of deceit. Together, the child embodied innocence and trust in its form. The prosecutor rose slowly, her movements deliberate, giving the moment room to breathe. She glanced toward the jury box, reading the expressions etched across their faces. She didn't need to say anything yet. She knew the truth was already at work. The defense attorney, however, had no such luxury. He stood, packing in a feigned act of control. His voice tried to project confidence, but the cracks were clear. "Ladies and of the jury," he began, "we cannot forget that children." Enough! The judge's voice cut clean through the room, not angry but absolute. You will have your chance during closing arguments. For now, sit down. The defense attorney froze, his mouth snapping shut. He lowered himself into his chair, cheeks burning under the weight of the reprimand. The jury's eyes lingered on him, unimpressed, some even hostile. In a single moment, his credibility had withered. Back at the witness stand, the child rubbed their tiny fists against tired eyes. Their courage had come in a rush like a wave, but now exhaustion followed. The handler leaned closer, his voice a soft whisper. You did good. You said what needed saying. You don't have to say more if you don't want to. The judge nodded in agreement. The witness may step down. Slowly, the guardian lifted the child from the stand, rising obediently beside them. The jurors' eyes followed the small figure as they were led back to the safety of the gallery. It was not pity they felt, it was reverence. The child had not just, they had transformed the trial. As the door closed gently behind them, the courtroom remained heavy with silence. Not the fearful kind from earlier, but an awe-filled quiet. Everyone sat in the aftershock of truth, each person processing what they had just witnessed. The prosecutor stood again, voice steady now but carrying a tremor of emotion. Your Honor, she said, the state rests. It was a declaration with gravity. She had nothing more to add, she didn't need to. The child's 2 words had become the prosecution's final, devastating piece of evidence. The judge gave a small nod. Very well, the defense may prepare its case for tomorrow morning. The gavel struck once, dismissing the day's proceedings. But no one rushed out. Instead, the courtroom seemed reluctant to move, as if leaving too quickly would shatter the fragile sanctity of what had transpired. Reporters in the back finally stood, whispering to one another, already crafting the story. Child's 2 words turned trial upside down. Cameras were forbidden inside, but the words would soon reach every newspaper, every television screen, every household. The jurors shuffled out quietly, their expressions grave, some visibly shaken. They had promised to weigh evidence with reason, not emotion, but they knew that reason and emotion had just collided in 2 undeniable words. The prosecutor gathered her files with calm precision, but her eyes lingered on the empty witness chair. She whispered to herself, that child, that dog, they did what I never could. The defense attorney slammed his briefcase shut, his jaw tight with frustration. He muttered to his co-counsel, we'll find a way to discredit this. We have to. But the hollow tone in his voice betrayed his doubt. He knew the damage was beyond repair. As the last few people filed out, the judge remained seated, staring at the quiet room. He had seen countless trials, countless testimonies, countless lies and truths tangled in webs of strategy, but never had he seen truth presented so simply, so unassailably. 2 words spoken from a child's lips had carried the weight of justice more than volumes of legal argument. He whispered under his breath, as if to himself, sometimes the smallest voices speak the loudest truths. In the hallway outside, the child clutched its leash, walking with small steps but a lighter heart. Spectators moved aside, giving them space, their eyes following with a mixture of admiration and tenderness. Some even whispered blessings under their breath. The handler gave a pat. Good boy, he said, but the look on his face showed he knew it was more than that. Wasn't just a good boy, he was the silent hero who had opened the door for truth. And as the child disappeared down the hall, hand wrapped tightly in its leash, the courtroom behind them seemed forever changed. The awe lingered, unspoken yet undeniable. 2 words had shattered silence. 2 words had turned fear into bravery. 2 words had shifted the scales of justice. And everyone who had heard them knew they would never forget. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed with a tension that felt heavier than usual. The hallways were crowded with reporters whispering into microphones, their voices carrying headlines before the trial even resumed. 3-year-old changes case with 2 words. Police dog unlocks truth in courtroom drama. It had taken less than 12 hours for the child's testimony to ripple beyond the courtroom walls. Inside, the defense attorneys shuffled papers with forced energy, their eyes shadowed by lack of sleep. Their strategy had been built on discrediting adult witnesses, twisting technicalities, and sowing doubt. But how could they discredit a child's innocent truth? How could they argue against words so unpolished yet so devastating? At the prosecutor's table, the atmosphere was different. The lead attorney looked rested, her confidence restored. She didn't rely on arrogance, only on the knowledge that the child's 2 words had pierced through the fog of the case. All she had to do now was hold steady. The truth was already doing the heavy lifting. The jurors filed back into their box, each one wearing a new gravity. They weren't the same group who had walked out yesterday. They had gone home, replayed the child's tiny voice in their heads, and found themselves unable to escape it. Some admitted silently that they had dreamt of it. He stayed. The phrase lingered, refusing to let go. When the judge entered, gavel in hand, the courtroom hushed immediately. He could sense the difference too. Yesterday's awe had hardened overnight into resolve. This was no longer just a trial. It was the weighing of truth against denial, and the truth already had a head start. The defense rose first, their voices brittle as they called their next witness. A middle-aged man, a supposed character witness for the defendant, shuffled nervously to the stand. The defense attorney's questions came sharp, clipped, desperate. "Did my client ever strike you as dishonest?" "No, sir," the man replied, his tone unconvincing. "Did you ever see him lose his temper with children?" "No, sir," the witness said again, his hands gripping the armrests of the chair. But every answer, though technically favorable to the defense, rang hollow in the air. The jurors weren't listening with open minds anymore. They were listening through the filter of the child's voice. Innocent testimony had shifted their perspective. Now, every attempt to repaint the defendant looked like cover-up. The prosecutor's cross-examination was calm, surgical. "Mister, isn't it true that you weren't present on the night in question?" "Yes, that's true." "So, all of your testimony is based on what the defendant told you, not what you witnessed yourself?" "Yes, ma'am." Her tone was polite, almost gentle. She didn't need aggression. The witness unraveled on his own. By the time he stepped down, sweat dampened his collar and his credibility was in tatters. The defense tried again with another witness, a distant cousin of the defendant who claimed he had an alibi. But under questioning, it emerged that the alibi was flimsy at best, based on an unverified phone call, not actual presence. The jurors glanced at one another, and the prosecutor noticed it too. Doubt had become certainty, and certainty had become conviction. Meanwhile, lay quietly at the back of the room, his handler by his side. Though the child no longer needed to testify, the judge had granted permission for to remain as a comfort presence for the court. People seemed calmer with him there. His steady breathing filled the pauses between testimonies, his calm posture reminding everyone of the previous day's breakthrough. He had become more than a dog. He was the silent guardian of truth. The defense attorney grew more agitated with each passing hour. His notes became frantic scribbles, his objections sharper, his tone more defensive. He knew he was losing, but he refused to yield. Finally, in a desperate move, he requested to recall the child for questioning, hoping to create cracks in their story. Gasps rippled through the gallery, and even the jurors stiffened at the suggestion. The prosecutor immediately objected. "Your Honor," she said firmly, "the child has already provided testimony that is both clear and sufficient. Forcing them to endure further questioning serves no purpose but intimidation." The judge's eyes narrowed. His voice was quiet but dangerous. "Counselor, this court will not allow the re-traumatization of a 3-year-old witness. Your request is—" The defense attorney opened his mouth to protest, but the gavel struck sharply. The judge repeated. The courtroom exhaled, relief sweeping like a wave. The jurors' expressions hardened further, their sympathy for the child translating into frustration toward the defense. Every move the attorney made only buried his case deeper. By mid-afternoon, the prosecution called its final witness, a forensic expert who tied together the evidence left at the scene. His testimony was meticulous, logical, and reinforced by hard data, but even he knew his role was secondary. He was there to provide the frame, while the child's words had already painted the picture. When the expert finished, the prosecutor rose. Her closing statement was brief but powerful. You heard the evidence. You saw the proof. But above all, you heard the truth from the only witness who mattered most. A child, barely 3 years old, with no reason to lie and no ability to craft stories. She told you what she saw, and in 2 words she told you everything. He stayed. She let the silence stretch, her eyes scanning the jury. I trust you to see what is clear, that innocence itself has spoken, and justice demands we listen. The defense attorney's closing was long, rambling, desperate. He spoke of memory being unreliable, of children being suggestible, of how the entire case was built on emotion rather than fact. But his words fell flat. The jurors sat stiff, some avoiding his gaze, others glaring openly. When he finally sat down, his shoulders sagged. He knew he had lost. The judge instructed the jury and dismissed them to deliberate. They filed out in silence, but the weight of their decision was already written on their faces. Hours passed, the courtroom restless with anticipation. People whispered, shuffled, checked the clock. The child had long since gone home with their guardian, trotting faithfully beside them, unaware of the legal storm his presence had helped calm. Finally, the bailiff entered with an envelope in hand. The jury has reached a verdict. The gallery stilled instantly. Reporters straightened in their seats, pens ready. The attorneys rose, hearts pounding for very different reasons. The jurors filed back in, their expressions grave, their eyes avoiding the defendant's gaze. The foreperson stood, holding the paper with trembling hands. In the matter of the state versus Daniel Brooks, she said, her voice steady but heavy with emotion, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts. The words crashed over the room like thunder. Gasps, cries, and murmurs erupted at once. The prosecutor closed her eyes, whispering a quiet thank you. The defense attorney slumped in his chair, face pale. The defendant cursed under his breath, his fists tightening on the table. The judge banged his gavel. Order, order in the court. He waited until the noise settled, then looked toward the jury. Your service is complete. Justice has been served. And in that moment, the trial that had once seemed unwinnable had been transformed entirely by 2 words from a child and the presence of a silent dog. The case was no longer about evidence alone. It was about the undeniable truth that even the smallest voice, when spoken with courage, can carry more weight than any argument. Justice had found its way through innocence, and the court, once heavy with doubt, now stood transformed. When the gavel fell for the final time, the trial was over, but the story was only beginning. The defendant was led away in handcuffs, his face pale and bitter. The prosecutor quietly gathered her files, though she hardly needed them anymore. The child's voice had carried the case where no document could. Reporters bolted from the courtroom, their voices spilling into microphones. Verdict reached. Justice delivered, child's testimony unforgettable. But the person at the center of it all, the 3-year-old whose 2 words had silenced a courtroom, wasn't there to see the verdict. She had gone home hours earlier with her guardian, tucked safely under a blanket while rested faithfully at her feet. The world was celebrating her courage, but she was blissfully unaware, asleep in the safety she had helped create. In the courthouse lobby, clusters of people lingered. Some were reporters drafting headlines. Others were jurors who whispered among themselves about what they had just been part of. Many said the same thing. They would never forget the sound of that child's tiny voice. For the jurors, the case was more than civic duty. It had become a moral reckoning. One juror, A mother herself admitted later that she had cried when she got home, holding her own child than ever before. Another, a retired teacher, said he had never believed in the weight of innocence until he heard those two words. Each one carried the moment with them like a scar, permanent and unforgettable. The prosecutor gave a brief statement outside the courthouse. Cameras flashed, questions flew, but her voice was steady. Justice is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it comes from the smallest among us. But it is always powerful. Today, justice spoke in two words, and we listened. Her statement spread across evening broadcasts, replayed on televisions and phones across the country. By the next morning, the phrase "he stayed" had become a trending topic, carried across social media platforms with messages of solidarity, encouragement, and even poetry inspired by the child's courage. 2. Found himself unexpectedly in the spotlight. Photos of him sitting patiently in the courtroom circulated online, his calm demeanor drawing admiration. Articles praised the growing role of support animals in legal proceedings, pointing to as a symbol of the compassion justice could embrace. Some even suggested awards for his service, though, of course, only wanted his handlers' praise and a good nap. In the weeks that followed, the child returned slowly to a sense of normalcy. She played with toys, went on walks, and asked simple questions about the world the way children do. She didn't fully understand what her two words had done, how they had swayed a jury, changed the course of a case, and brought peace to people who had been waiting so long for justice. To her, was just a friend with soft fur and kind eyes, someone who had made her feel safe when everything else felt too big. Her guardian, however, understood. She carried both pride and sorrow in equal measure. Pride because her little one had spoken with more courage than most adults ever could. Sorrow because innocence had been forced to speak at all. She promised herself that the child would grow up shielded now, not by silence but by love. The trial's outcome also sparked changes beyond the individuals involved. Lawmakers began to revisit policies about child witnesses, inspired by the undeniable impact of support animals. Discussions emerged about expanding programs that allowed trained dogs-like to assist vulnerable witnesses in courtrooms across the country. Judges and attorneys debated, but the consensus was clear. The presence of comfort animals could transform the courtroom into a place not only of justice, but also of humanity. Handler received letters from strangers across the nation. Parents wrote about how their children had been inspired, teachers about how they had shared the story in classrooms to teach courage, therapists about how hope had bloomed in clients who had once felt voiceless. Each letter was a ripple, spreading out from the single moment when a child had whispered truth into the world. Even the judge, known for his stern demeanor, spoke publicly after the trial in a rare interview. "I've presided over hundreds of cases," he said, "but this one will stay with me. Justice is often tangled, complex, clouded by arguments and evidence, but every so often it arrives in its form, uncomplicated and undeniable. That's what happened here. A child reminded us that truth doesn't need to be long-winded. Sometimes truth is two words." The defendant's sentencing came weeks later, but it felt almost anticlimactic. By then, the real verdict had already been written in the hearts of those who witnessed it. The community, once fractured by the case, now found healing in the shared memory of the child's bravery. As months turned into years, the story continued to live on. Documentaries were made, articles published, and conferences held where legal experts discussed the power of innocent testimony. But the most enduring legacy wasn't in headlines or academic papers. It was in the quiet strength people found in their own lives, inspired by the child's example. Survivors of trauma wrote about feeling less alone. Parents used the story to remind their children that their voices mattered. And in countless households, "he stayed" became shorthand for the idea that truth can survive against all odds. The child grew, of course. She went from toddler to child, from child to young adult, carrying a story she didn't fully remember but which had shaped her life nonetheless. Her guardian chose carefully how to explain it as she got older, not as a burden but as a legacy of courage. When she asked why people sometimes recognized her name, her guardian said simply, "Because you were brave when it mattered most." And he eventually retired from service, his muzzle graying, his steps slowing. But even in retirement, he remained a hero in the eyes of those who knew his story. Children who met him often asked to pet the dog who helped in court, and he accepted their affection with gentle patience. When he passed, years later, tributes poured in, honoring him as more than just a dog. He was a partner in justice, a friend to innocence, a quiet guardian of truth. The story of the child and became more than just a courtroom memory. It became a parable told at dinner tables, in classrooms, in court training programs. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful testimonies are not the loudest, but the simplest. That courage can live in a whisper, and justice can be found in the smallest of voices. And so, though the trial had ended long ago, its echoes never faded. The child's 2 words, spoken with the trust of innocence and the strength of a dog's quiet companionship, continued to ripple through lives, laws, and hearts. 2 words that changed a case. 2 words that carried justice. 2 words that proved even the smallest voice can roar louder than silence. He stayed, and the world never forgot.